On Sunday at lunch, a very dear friend of mine looked at me and said, "Oh, lifelong learning." And I said, "Yes." And he said, I thought I knew everything about the Civil War. Well, every time she is with us, I learn a great deal. And isn't that why we're here? I think the key question in life, at this point in my life, is always, what did you learn? What did you learn is the question. On Sunday morning, I say a prayer of confession. I need to. But the real issue is not what I've done, but what did I learn from what I did? Because unless I learn, I'm going to do it again. We do not learn from experience. We learn from reflection on experience. Dr. Martinez comes to have us learn. The rule is, you remember, if you have a question, if you have a wonder, if you have a worry, raise your hand at any point, and she will gather that in. Dr. Martinez, it's always an honor to have you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. I appreciate everyone coming and engaging and asking your questions. And I might ask you some questions this time. We'll see how that goes. Um, I don't know. I suspect you guys are more willing to speak up than some of our freshman students. You're used to talking to people and not phones. So um, let's return to a subject we looked at in the spring, which is Native Americans during the Civil War. And we finished, if you remember in March, I think it was March, we talked about peoples who were from the Southeast, who remained in the Southeast. We talked about the Lumbee experience, but we put that in the context of a lot of other Southeastern nations who were too small and disorganized to have been subject to forced removal in the 19th century. And then we shifted our focus to the Southeastern tribes who had been removed to what was called Indian Territory at the time. I want to go back there, and I want to not just talk about the Cherokee and the Creek and those groups, but Indian Territory more broadly. So what I'm thinking we'll do with these 3 weeks is kind of set up big themes, big questions, and then move forward with a couple of examples in the following 2 sessions. I'm going to occasionally share among the images some of what's called ledger art. Has anyone ever seen or heard of ledger art? Is this something you're familiar with? So a lot of this comes from the Plains tribes, the Plains nations in the mid to late 19th century, depicting their history, depicting their stories, sometimes, very often stories of warfare and battles, but not exclusively. A lot of these things come from the 1870s, so the period right after the Civil War. And they're called ledger art because they were making this art on paper pulled out of giant ledger books provided for them to keep track of trade with the US government. And so it was the only paper they often had access to. And so they used the ledger books, as they often did, used new materials coming to them from the US government to make things for their communities and to depict their histories. Not entirely, but was a traditional way. But by the 1870s, most of Native communities that still retained their language were looking for ways to write it down. But they were also using these traditional forms of recording their histories through images, but not depicting them on buffalo hides anymore, which had grown quite rare. Depicting them instead on paper, right? Using the paper that they had available to them. So this is actually a depiction of Sand Creek, which we'll talk about in the coming weeks. So I have a big kind of question for you, and a question among historians. As we have been broadening the Civil War to talk more about the West, right? often we get the question, right? And amongst ourselves, ask this question. Are the things we traditionally think of as the Indian Wars of the mid to late 19th century part of the story of the Civil War? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
What dates are you?
We can start as early. We can start really as early as the 1840s and 1850s with the Seminole Wars. Right? Certainly, there are things going on in the 1860s during the sort of 1861 to 1865 that we think of as the Civil War timeframe. Those battles